Captain James Mitchell stood at a weapons demonstration at Nui Dat in March 1968 and observed something that created immediate tension between American and Australian military personnel. An American officer had made an offhand comment about the Australian L1A1 self-loading rifle that was apparently intended to be humorous, but that the Australian soldiers received as insulting. The American officer, a captain named Robert Lewis, had gestured toward the Australian rifles and commented, "Those are some stubby little rifles you Australians carry. We Americans prefer our rifles with more barrel length for better accuracy." The comment created immediate silence among the Australian soldiers present. The Australian soldiers had been discussing their weapons with American personnel in a professional context. Lewis's comment appeared to have changed the tone of the discussion. An Australian sergeant named Thomas Brennan responded with a mixture of amusement and challenge. "Our rifles are not stubby. Our L1A1 is precisely engineered for jungle warfare. The barrel length is appropriate for the distances at which jungle engagements typically occur. Your M16 is overly long for jungle operations." Lewis responded dismissively, "The M16 is shorter than your rifle. It is more manageable in close quarters." Brennan's response was direct. "Ours is longer, Yank, and the longer barrel length provides better ballistic performance at the ranges at which jungle engagements occur." This exchange, which had begun as seemingly lighthearted comparison of weapons, had taken on a tone of challenge and assertion. The Australian soldiers were apparently not willing to accept American characterization of the Australian L1A1 as inferior to the American M16. Over the following hours, the weapons comparison became increasingly detailed. American and Australian soldiers conducted informal tests comparing the accuracy, reliability, and performance of the two rifles. The tests revealed something that surprised the American soldiers. The L1A1, despite its longer barrel length, was not significantly less maneuverable in close quarters than the M16. The L1A1 had superior ballistic performance at extended ranges. The L1A1 had greater reliability in adverse conditions, particularly in jungle environments where moisture and debris could affect weapons performance. These characteristics reflected different design philosophies. The M16 had been designed for rapid fire and high ammunition capacity. The L1A1 had been designed for reliability and ballistic performance in difficult environments. By the end of the weapons comparison, the American soldiers had developed a new respect for the L1A1. The Australian soldiers had demonstrated that the L1A1 was not inferior to the M16, despite being longer and somewhat heavier. The phrase, "ours is longer," became part of the banter between American and Australian soldiers. The phrase was used by Australian soldiers whenever the comparison between the M16 and the L1A1 was discussed. But the phrase also represented something more significant. The phrase represented Australian assertion of the validity of their equipment and their design philosophy. The phrase represented Australian refusal to accept American characterization of Australian equipment as inferior. By April 1968, the weapons comparison incident had spread through military circles at Long Bin and at other American installations. The incident became part of military folklore associated with American-Australian military interactions. One American officer made an observation that captured something important about what the weapons comparison had revealed. The Australians are not defensive about their equipment. They are confident in their equipment. When we questioned the superiority of their weapons, they did not attempt to defend their weapons. They demonstrated through testing that their weapons were appropriate for jungle warfare. That confidence is impressive. The weapons comparison had revealed something about how Australian soldiers perceived their equipment and how Australian soldiers approached questions of military capability. Australian soldiers were confident in their equipment. Australian soldiers were willing to conduct comparative testing to demonstrate the validity of their equipment. By May 1968, American military leadership had become interested in understanding the comparative capabilities of the M16 and the L1A1. American commanders wanted to know whether the L1A1 offered advantages in jungle warfare that the M16 did not offer. A formal comparison was conducted between the M16 and the L1A1. American military engineers and weapons specialists conducted detailed analysis of the two rifles. The analysis examined ballistic performance, reliability, ammunition capacity, and maneuverability in various conditions. The results of the analysis confirmed observations that had emerged from the informal weapons comparison. The L1A1 had superior ballistic performance at extended ranges. The L1A1 had greater reliability in adverse jungle conditions. The M16 had greater ammunition capacity and faster rate of fire. The analysis concluded that the L1A1 was better suited for the specific conditions of jungle warfare in Southeast Asia, while the M16 was better suited for more conventional combat operations, where rapid fire and high ammunition capacity were advantageous. This conclusion prompted questions about whether American forces should be equipped with weapons that were better suited for jungle warfare. But changing weapons systems at that point in the war was not practical. The American military had committed to the M16, and changing to the L1A1 would have created enormous logistical complications. Instead, American military leadership decided to improve the training and tactics for using the M16 in jungle warfare. American soldiers were trained to use the M16's advantages in rate of fire and ammunition capacity to compensate for its disadvantages in ballistic performance and reliability. By June 1968, the weapons comparison incident had contributed to broader understanding of how different weapon systems were optimized for different types of warfare. The comparison had revealed that the L1A1 was not inferior to the M16, despite being longer and somewhat heavier. The comparison had revealed that equipment design should be matched to operational environment and operational requirements. The phrase, "ours is longer," persisted as a reminder of the weapons comparison. The phrase became part of how American and Australian soldiers discussed weapon systems and military equipment. By 1969, as the Australian military presence in Vietnam was beginning to wind down, the weapons comparison had become part of the folklore of American-Australian military interactions. The comparison was remembered not because it had changed American military equipment procurement, but because it had revealed something about how different design philosophies could produce weapons that were equally valid, but optimized for different purposes. One American officer reflected on the significance of the weapons comparison. "The Australians taught us that there is no single best weapon system. The best weapon system is the one that is optimized for the specific conditions in which it will be used." The L1A1 was better optimized for jungle warfare than the M16. But the M16 was better optimized for conventional combat operations. The lesson is that equipment should be matched to operational requirements. By the year 2000, the weapons comparison had become part of military history. The comparison was cited in military academies when discussing how weapon systems should be evaluated and compared. The comparison was cited in discussions of how equipment design should be matched to operational environment. One military historian wrote about the weapons comparison in a comprehensive study of American-Australian military interactions in Vietnam. The comparison between the M16 and the L1A1 revealed fundamental differences in how American and Australian weapons designers approached the problem of creating effective rifles. The comparison also revealed Australian confidence in their equipment and American willingness to acknowledge that different equipment systems could be equally valid while optimized for different purposes. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after the weapons comparison incident had occurred. The phrase, "ours is longer," remained part of military folklore among veterans of Vietnam. The phrase was remembered with humor and affection as part of how American and Australian soldiers had interacted. The slouch hat represented Australian military adaptation and tactical effectiveness. The weapons comparison incident represented something different. It represented how Australian soldiers had asserted the validity of their equipment and their design philosophy in the face of American assumptions about weapons superiority. These represented different kinds of Australian influence on American military in Vietnam. Both influenced how American military personnel understood military effectiveness and military equipment. By the year 2025, the weapons comparison had become part of how American military personnel understood equipment evaluation and weapons systems design. American military personnel understood that equipment should be optimized for specific operational requirements rather than pursuing universal superiority in all dimensions. This understanding, which had been demonstrated by the L1A1 rifle and by the Australian soldiers who carried it, persisted long after the Australian military had departed Vietnam and long after the M16 had been replaced by more modern weapon systems. The slouch hat had become an icon. The L1A1 rifle had become a symbol of how Australian soldiers had influenced American military thinking about weapon systems and military equipment. Both had contributed to how American military evolved in response to the Australian presence in Vietnam.